There is no difficulty that enough love will not conquer, no disease that enough love will not heal, no door that enough love will not open. Nearly a century ago, Emmet Fox left us this exact mathematical observation for nights identical to this one. You lie there in the dark, watching the cold blue light of your smartphone illuminate the ceiling, staring at a bank balance that feels less like a number and more like a prison sentence. Or perhaps you feel that dull, heavy pressure behind your eyes after surviving 2 hours of gridlock traffic, replaying a difficult conversation from earlier today, mentally answering an email you haven't even opened yet. The walls of your schedule seem to contract around you, and every instinct in your modern nervous system is shouting at you to fight. Your culture has trained you to believe that survival requires grit, that you must clench your jaw, muster your willpower, and force a way through the concrete barrier of your problems through sheer, agonizing exertion. But the bone-deep weariness that holds you pinned to your mattress right now is not proof that you are failing at the battle of life. It is the absolute symptom of trying to wage a spiritual war with primitive tools. The human intellect, when hijacked by survival panic, operates under the tragic illusion of brute force. You convince yourself that if you run your current crisis through your mind 500 times before midnight, you are somehow doing the responsible work of problem solving. You transform your own inner consciousness into a relentless courtroom where your anxiety acts simultaneously as the prosecutor, the witness, and the judge. In the pages Fox compiled during the most turbulent decades of the 20th century, he mapped out an immutable, impersonal law. Your physical reality is nothing more than the printed receipt of your mental equivalent. Whatever condition you harbor with intense, agonized focus inside your mind, the machinery of the universe is strictly obligated to materialize in your outer experience. When you spend your days fiercely wrestling with your debt, your failing health, or your isolation, you are actively feeding your own vital substance into the very shape of your terror. You cannot clear the darkness out of a room by beating the air with a stick. You simply switch on the lamp, and the darkness, possessing no independent reality of its own, instantly vanishes. Your exhausting struggle to fix your life by sheer muscular will is precisely what holds your deadbolts locked. Picture an old blacksmith working in the industrial outskirts of London in the bitter winter of 1930. He is handed a thick, stubborn bar of cold iron and given the task of bending it to form the reinforced rim of a carriage wheel. If that man places the freezing metal onto his anvil and strikes it with his heaviest sledgehammer, throwing every ounce of his back and shoulders into the violent blow, he will achieve only 2 mathematical results. He will fracture his own hammer and shatter the delicate bones in his wrists. The cold iron will remain rigidly straight, mocking his haste. But the master craftsman does not waste a single drop of sweat fighting the rigidity of the metal. He simply takes the heavy bar and lays it to rest in the dead center of the forge. He does not scream at the iron to yield. He merely works the bellows and allows the silent fire to perform its invisible chemistry. Minute after minute, the heat permeates the deepest atomic structure of the steel. Without a single decibel of noise, without a shred of violence, the dull gray shifts to a deep ruby red and finally to a brilliant, incandescent white. When the smith gently lifts it out with his tongs, that very same iron that would have broken a boulder a moment ago now bows under the weight of a quiet touch, yielding as softly as warm wax. As your eyes continue to track whatever is right in front of you, or as your physical frame rests in whatever posture it happens to occupy at this exact second, simply notice the residual tension stored across your collarbones. Do not attempt to forcefully relax your muscles. Just passively observe how many hours you have spent this week acting like that frantic, ignorant blacksmith, hammering away at the freezing iron of your material circumstances, demanding that external bank accounts change, that stubborn people change, that past mistakes rewrite themselves through the sheer friction of your worry. Without shifting your physical position by a single millimeter, Recognize the profound, silent relief that floods your chest the instant you accept that you do not have to fix the world tonight. Your sole responsibility is not to hammer the bent piece of your reality straight, but to drop it quietly into the center of the correct mental flame, allowing a higher substance to perform the bending that your anxiety never could. Yet, there is a dangerous psychological trap that captures the vast majority of people the very first time they attempt to step away from the anvil and apply this law of substitution. When they try to shift their mental equivalent away from the crisis, they commit a subtle technical error, a misstep that instantly converts their attempt at spiritual rest into a brand new fuel for their own panic. The exact anatomy of this invisible self-sabotage is what we will dismantle next. Stop thinking about the difficulty, whatever it is, and think about God instead. This is the complete rule, and if only you will do this, the trouble, whatever it is, will presently disappear. In his 1934 masterpiece, The Golden Key, Emmet Fox outlined this instruction not as a poetic comfort to soothe the sentimental, but as a rigid scientific formula for human survival. Tonight, as you feel that tight, persistent knot of tension behind your solar plexus, or watch the digital numbers on your nightstand clock silently ticking away your remaining hours of sleep, your immediate instinct is to dissect your distress. You mentally open your financial spreadsheet, you anxiously rehearse tomorrow morning's confrontation, you analyze every subtle ache in your body or every stagnant metric of your career, truly believing that intense, agonizing preoccupation is the responsible way to live. Yet Fox observed that the human intellect possesses a fatal mechanical flaw. The more fiercely you contemplate an obstacle, the more mass, density, and absolute permanence you grant it within your own consciousness. By attempting to resolve your crisis through sheer intellectual wrestling, you are actively manufacturing the exact conditions that keep your deadbolts locked. You are magnifying the shadow, feeding it your own sacred vitality, until it completely eclipses your mental horizon. Consider the uncompromising, silent physics of a massive hydroelectric dam built across a raging mountain river. Behind that curving wall of reinforced concrete, millions of tons of dark, heavy water press furiously against the barrier, seeking an escape. Imagine an exhausted, panicked novice engineer standing at the base of that structure in the dead of night, terrified by the crushing weight of the reservoir. In his terror, he grabs a metal bucket and attempts to bail the water out from the spillway, hurling cupfuls of liquid into the darkness with aching, trembling arms. Or worse, he presses his own fragile shoulders directly against the weeping micro-fissures in the concrete, praying that his physical muscles can somehow hold back the weight of an entire lake. His agony is entirely genuine. His exhaustion is absolute. But his methodology is profoundly absurd. The river does not negotiate with human sweat. Now observe the silent efficiency of the dam's true release mechanism. Deep inside the subterranean bedrock, far below the churning surface of the flood, sits a small, perfectly balanced hydraulic valve. It requires no muscular strain, no screaming effort, no violence whatsoever. When the engineer simply turns that small dial with a gentle motion of his wrist, an invisible shift occurs inside the pressurized chambers. The immense, crushing weight of the reservoir is instantly redirected into the turbine blades. That very same mass of water that threatened to obliterate the concrete wall a moment ago is suddenly converted into pure, illuminating electrical power, lighting up 1 million homes across an entire metropolis. The water was never the enemy. The direction of its flow was the only issue. As you listen to these words, whether your hands are steering a vehicle through empty city streets, folding laundry, or whether your physical frame rests entirely motionless upon your bed, simply notice where the weight of your attention is currently anchored. Do not attempt to forcefully quiet your thoughts. Just passively observe how you have spent the last several days acting like that panicked engineer, pressing your fragile nervous system against the crushing wall of your circumstances, trying to hold back the flood of life with your bare hands. Without altering your physical posture by a single fraction of an inch, recognize the profound mechanical truth. Your willpower is fundamentally inadequate to hold back the river, and it was never designed to do so. Your only function is to step away from the concrete wall and turn the valve of your attention away from the flood, directing your mental equivalent toward the absolute source of power. Yet when people attempt to execute this mental pivot and apply the golden key, they frequently fall into a devastating psychological trap. They try to forcefully suppress their dark thoughts, waging a brutal internal war against their own minds to maintain an artificial state of positivity. This mental friction creates a violence so severe that it eventually fractures the subconscious, turning the practice of spiritual alignment into a secondary source of panic. The precise anatomy of this internal sabotage and how to bypass it entirely without a fight is what we will examine next. When you resist a difficulty, you are feeding it. Anything to which you give your attention, you are feeding with your own life and substance. The instructions set down by Fox in his foundational manual of mental conduct are the exact mirror of what happens to your nervous system on those sleepless, dead-of-night hours when rest refuses to come. You toss on your mattress, reach for your smartphone to check the glowing numbers, and realize there are only 3 hours left before your alarm sounds. Instantly, a familiar wave of heat creeps up through your chest. You calculate the exhaustion you will face in tomorrow morning's corporate review, anticipate the bumper-to-bumper gridlock, and begin to wage a furious internal warfare against your own insomnia. You order yourself to sleep. You squeeze your eyelids shut with aching intensity. You count your breaths like a desperate infantryman trapped in a trench. And the harder you fight to shut down your brain, the more hyper-alert, electric, and agonizingly awake you remain. You convince yourself that this bone-deep weariness is the fault of a ruthless world demanding too much of your flesh, failing to realize that your exhaustion is manufactured entirely by your active resistance against what you cannot physically control. The subconscious architecture does not process commands of negation. It operates as an uncompromising mathematical recording engine of magnetic resonance. When you spend your afternoon vigilantly policing your anxiety in a desperate attempt to annihilate it, or when you spend weeks mentally prosecuting an economic injustice to assign blame, you are operating at maximum horsepower in precisely the wrong direction. You are pouring your sacred vitality directly into the mold of your own scarcity. Emmet Fox repeatedly warned that trying to eradicate a dark mental habit through sheer force of will is the spiritual equivalent of trying to hold down a compressed steel spring with your bare thumbs. You may keep it pinned to the floor for a few exhausting minutes through immense muscular strain, but the very millisecond your fatigue overcomes you, the spring rebounds with triple its original velocity. True metaphysical liberation demands no sweat, no gritting of teeth, and zero combat. It requires the cold, scientific application of the law of substitution. You do not wrestle with the shadows. You simply pivot the lens of your attention, allowing the lower frequency to wither away from pure starvation. Revisit for a brief moment an old, fading scene archived somewhere in the basement of your memory. You were perhaps 9 or 10 years old. It was a late Sunday afternoon, and you were sitting on your bedroom carpet struggling with a complex puzzle or a mechanical toy that stubbornly refused to fit together. You tried one plastic piece, you forced another, jamming the edges against the base with mounting panic. Your small fingers began to ache, your breathing turned shallow and erratic, and a bitter, suffocating sense of cosmic injustice took root in your stomach. It felt as though that inanimate piece of plastic was actively mocking you, conspiring to expose your personal inadequacy. You gripped the object with all the helpless fury of your 10 years until the piece bent, snapped, or shattered in your palms. You sat there weeping from sheer frustration, certain that the universe was fundamentally cold, hostile, and uncompromising, The piece did not yield to your rage, and the broken toy remained scattered across the floor as a permanent monument to your frantic haste. As your physical frame continues to bear the quiet weight of your daily routine at this exact second, or as your attention drifts across the room you currently occupy, simply notice the striking resemblance between that frustrated child on the bedroom carpet and the modern adult you are today. Without altering your breathing pattern and without attempting to fix a single broken element of your life right now, observe how you are still gripping the shattered pieces of your relationships, your career, and your finances, trying to jam them into the puzzle board of your reality through emotional violence and mental exhaustion. Notice the immediate, quiet wave of relief that washes down your spine the instant you understand that you do not have to force those pieces together tonight. You have the cosmic permission to drop the broken toy onto the floor, stand up, and look out the window, allowing your mind to rest in the certainty that the natural order of the universe does not depend on your strained, anxious manipulation. Yet there is a profound metaphysical error that the vast majority of people make when they finally drop the broken piece and attempt to apply the golden key. A subtle miscalculation of mental alignment that secretly converts their very attempt at peaceful prayer into a high-octane fuel for their own terror. The precise mechanical anatomy of this invisible self-sabotage is what we will dismantle next. When you turn to God for a solution, the problem frequently seems to grow much worse before it begins to improve. Do not let this discourage you. It is merely the dust rising when you start to clean the house. You hear this historical warning from Emmet Fox today, and suddenly the chaotic events of your last 48 hours make complete mathematical sense. You went through the exact internal procedure. You absorbed the master's instructions, you stepped away from the ledge of your daily panic, and for one brief, uncompromising hour, you genuinely surrendered the weight of your crisis. You successfully applied the golden key. You withdrew your anxious gaze from your deteriorating credit score. You detached your attention from your medical diagnosis. You stopped attempting to force a stubborn person to change their behavior. And you rested your mental equivalent in the vast, quiet certainty of the absolute. For a few precious moments, you experienced the staggering, weightless relief of a prisoner who has finally dropped a heavy sledgehammer onto the floor of his cell. You slept profoundly. You woke up with a strange, unfamiliar quietness inside your solar plexus. But then, almost as if the material universe were actively punishing you for your newfound peace, your telephone rang. An unexpected invoice arrived with aggressive interest rates attached to it. The individual you had forgiven in your silence yesterday sent an even more hostile message this morning. The physical inflammation that seemed to have subsided began to throb with triple its original intensity. A bitter, acidic wave of terror rushed up into your throat, and the shrill, analytical voice of your intellect screamed immediately, "Look, you see? It failed." This metaphysical philosophy is a delusional trap. Act right now, or everything you have built will collapse. And in a single heartbeat, you were dragged back down into the dirt, frantically reaching for the broken hammer, preparing to beat against the cold iron of your life with desperate, exhausted hands. Yet the clinical genius of Fox's philosophy lies in his clinical exposure of this false physical rebound. What your terrified intellect interprets as absolute proof of spiritual failure is, in the rigid mechanics of the universe, the definitive scientific evidence that the high-frequency substance is successfully sweeping through your obsolete system. Consider the foundational structure of the reality you inhabit. Every established condition in your material world, whether it is built of concrete, human tissue, or crystallized financial debt, possesses a profound, stubborn inertia. Your current crisis did not materialize out of nowhere. It has been steadily anchoring itself into your biology, your nervous habits, and your daily environment over years of anxious contemplation. When you suddenly introduce the high voltage of a pure spiritual alignment into this old, calcified machinery, the obsolete structure does not simply dissolve in a smooth, poetic mist. It shudders, it groans. The rusty gears of your old reality screech violently under the intense friction of the new frequency. Fox explicitly categorized this turbulent phenomenon under the scientific term chemicalization, the exact, unavoidable interval where a higher spiritual substance penetrates an established error, provoking a chemical reaction that forces old, stagnant debris to boil violently to the surface. This temporary storm is not the cosmos seeking vengeance. It is the toxic buildup of your own past equivalent being ruthlessly purged through the pores of your physical experience. Step back in time and stand outside a monumental Victorian stone edifice in the crowded streets of New York City during the freezing winter of 1933. The Great Depression was grinding the spirit of millions into dust, and every Wednesday afternoon, thousands of desperate men and women pushed through the doors of the New York Hippodrome to listen to Emmet Fox. Among those listening was a formerly wealthy Manhattan real estate broker who had lost his entire fortune in the stock market crash, his properties seized, his family facing immediate eviction. Following Fox's rigid instructions, this broken man went home, locked himself in his freezing bedroom, absolutely refused to read the terrifying economic headlines, and practiced the scientific prayer of spiritual opulence for 20 minutes every night. By the end of the first week, he felt a profound, unshakable internal serenity. On the morning of the 8th day, however, 2 sheriff's deputies arrived at his front door with a final, unnegotiable notice of eviction, giving him 72 hours to vacate the premises. The man ran back through the freezing snow to Fox's private office in absolute hysterics, weeping, screaming that the prayer had accelerated his ruin. Fox sat completely motionless behind his desk, looked at the trembling broker with the calm, detached eyes of a laboratory chemist and said, "You have spent 5 years building a towering structure of economic terror inside your mind. Did you truly expect the foundation of that skyscraper to be demolished without raising a massive cloud of dust? Go back to your room, ignore the paper in your hand, and let the dust settle." The broker returned to his freezing apartment, forced himself to sit in the center of his packed cardboard boxes, and maintained his internal gaze entirely on the divine source. 48 hours later, an old business acquaintance he had not spoken to in 7 years miraculously tracked him down to his exact street address, offering him an executive partnership in a newly funded enterprise, an opportunity that not only cleared his immediate debts within a week, but established a lasting financial security he had never known before the crash. The final eviction notice was never executed. It was merely the loud, terrifying screech of an old reality collapsing to make room for the new. As your physical frame continues to navigate the silent demands of your evening, whether your eyes are casually scanning the shadows of your room or your hands are resting upon a steering wheel, simply observe the current state of your internal dialogue. Do not attempt to forcefully quiet your mounting anxiety. Just passively observe how quickly you are tempted to shut the windows of your consciousness and surrender to panic simply because the dust of your circumstances has begun to swirl. Without altering your physical posture by a single fraction of an inch, feel the profound, quiet weight lifting off your shoulders the instant you recognize that you are strictly forbidden from reacting to this temporary chaos. The turbulent storm surrounding your finances, your health, or your relationships right now is nothing more than the audible friction of the divine cure operating at the deepest root of the infection. Your sole responsibility is to stand perfectly still in the center of the room and allow the fresh wind to sweep the dead leaves out the open door. Yet, surviving this turbulent night of the material world requires an absolute mastery over a subtle biological impulse that 99% of human beings completely underestimate. The moment people observe this rising dust of chemicalization, they fall into the fatal trap of trying to physically assist the light, launching frantic, premature actions in the material world to speed up the cleaning process, a devastating psychological error that instantly severs the electrical circuit in the middle of the transformation and aborts the manifestation. How to recognize and permanently disarm this dangerous urge for premature action is the final, practical secret we will uncover next. When you turn to God for a solution, the problem frequently seems to grow much worse before it begins to improve. Do not let this discourage you. It is merely the dust rising when you start to clean the house. You hear this specific historical warning from Emmet Fox tonight, and suddenly the turbulent events of your last 48 hours make complete mathematical sense. You went through the exact internal procedure. You absorbed the master's instructions, you stepped away from the precipice of your daily panic, and for one brief, uncompromising hour, you genuinely surrendered the weight of your crisis. You successfully applied the golden key. You withdrew your anxious gaze from your deteriorating credit score. You detached your attention from your medical diagnosis. You stopped attempting to force a stubborn person to change their behavior, and you rested your mental equivalent in the vast, quiet certainty of the absolute. For a few precious moments, you experienced the staggering, weightless relief of a prisoner who has finally dropped a heavy sledgehammer onto the concrete floor of his cell. You slept profoundly. You woke up with a strange, unfamiliar quietness inside your solar plexus. But then, almost as if the material universe were actively punishing you for your newfound peace, your telephone rang. An unexpected invoice arrived with aggressive interest rates attached to it. The individual you had forgiven in your silence yesterday sent an even more hostile message this morning. The physical inflammation that seemed to have subsided began to throb with triple its original intensity. A bitter, acidic wave of terror rushed up into your throat, and the shrill, analytical voice of your intellect screamed immediately, "Look! You see? It failed!" This metaphysical philosophy is a delusional trap. Act right now, or everything you have built will collapse. And in a single heartbeat, you were dragged back down into the dirt, frantically reaching for the broken hammer, preparing to beat against the cold iron of your life with desperate, exhausted hands. Yet the clinical genius of Fox's philosophy lies in his clinical exposure of this false physical rebound. What your terrified intellect interprets as absolute proof of spiritual failure is, in the rigid mechanics of the universe, the definitive scientific evidence that the high-frequency substance is successfully sweeping through your obsolete system. Consider the foundational structure of the reality you inhabit. Every established condition in your material world, whether it is built of concrete, human tissue, or crystallized financial debt, possesses a profound, stubborn inertia. Your current crisis did not materialize out of nowhere. It has been steadily anchoring itself into your biology, your nervous habits, and your daily environment over years of anxious contemplation. When you suddenly introduce the high voltage of a pure spiritual alignment into this old, calcified machinery, the obsolete structure does not simply dissolve in a smooth, poetic mist. It shudders. It groans. The rusty gears of your old reality screech violently under the intense friction of the new frequency. Fox explicitly categorized this turbulent phenomenon under the scientific term chemicalization, the exact, unavoidable interval where a higher spiritual substance penetrates an established error, provoking a chemical reaction that forces old, stagnant debris to boil violently to the surface. This temporary storm is not the cosmos seeking vengeance. It is the toxic buildup of your own past equivalent being ruthlessly purged through the pores of your physical experience. This brings us to the ultimate philosophical dissolution of your remaining fear. When the storm of chemicalization rages around you, your primitive survival instinct demands that you jump into the machinery to manually fix the gears. You feel an agonizing urge to send that defensive email, to make that desperate phone call, to take out another disastrous loan just to quiet the immediate noise. But true spiritual science requires the absolute paralysis of the frantic human ego. You must realize tonight that your human personality, the exhausted avatar bearing your legal name, your social security number, and your accumulated traumas, was never designed to be the general contractor of your destiny. It is merely the receiving instrument. When you frantically interfere with the clearing process, You are like an impatient patient who continuously tears off a surgical bandage to see if the incision is healing, bleeding all over the fresh sutures and resetting the clock of recovery back to zero. The absolute rest Fox advocated is not laziness. It is the highest, most terrifying form of mental discipline. It is the conscious decision to stand completely still inside the burning room, watching the old plaster crumble, fully knowing that the fire is only consuming what was already dead. You do not have to negotiate with the wreckage. You do not have to apologize for the falling dust. You merely hold the mental equivalent of complete restoration, letting the impersonal law of the universe execute the heavy lifting while your physical body rests in absolute safety. As your physical frame continues to navigate the silent demands of this evening, whether your eyes are casually tracking the shadows across your bedroom walls or your hands are resting gently upon a steering wheel, simply observe the profound quietness that arrives when you surrender your need to control the timeline. Do not attempt to force a feeling of gratitude or spiritual ecstasy. Just passively observe how your nervous system instantly drops its defensive armor the millisecond you accept that the current chaos is merely the sound of your old reality being dismantled to make room for the new. Without shifting your posture by a single fraction of an inch, feel the deep, cellular relief of knowing that your daily struggles were never your identity. They were only the temporary scaffolding of a life you've already outgrown. The dust is finally settling across the chambers of your mind. The doors you thought were locked forever are swinging open on silent hinges, requiring no effort, no struggle, and no fight whatsoever. The work is finished, the law is satisfied, and you are finally free to rest.